All right, guys. I'd like to welcome you to this course in the philosophy of religion. Now, if you've had this or a similar course with me before, say ethics or worldview, uh, or possibly another philosophy-related course, um, then you essentially know what you're in for, right? We're going to try to look at different positions, right? Specifically here within the philosophy of religion, and evaluate those uh, just with sound philosophical principles, right? With logic, with the tools of reason, and of course, that which we know through revelation in some sense, right? Now, having said that, I want to let's go ahead and flip our slide up here. Let's go ahead and get our slides going. So this is going to be, as I've already hinted at least somewhat in those initial remarks, is that this is going to look at the relationship between faith and reason, right? So this first lecture is going to primarily concern itself with the relationship between faith and reason, meaning what is the relationship between faith and reason? Is there a relationship between faith and reason? Now, because this is a philosophy course, right, it would be natural to expect that this would be the initial subject, the initial topic that we're going to try to look at as we discuss the philosophy of religion. Namely, is there a relationship between philosophy and religion? In the sense, the Western or analytic sense of what we would normally use or normally mean by philosophy. If we're talking about like the analyzing of the reasonableness of the rationality thereof, how does that pertain, right? Do those even go together? Is faith just something like a leap in the dark, right? Now let's go ahead and start to look at some of these here, right, on our screen. Now, these are just going to be some preliminary remarks, right? Now, as the slide says, this is going to be similar to other philosophy courses that we've gone through because you're going to be asking the same types of questions, right? When we talk about the relationship between faith and reason, and if there is one, we're going to look at epistemological type questions, right? Like, how do we know what we know about religion? We're going to look at metaphysical questions, such as if there is a God, right? What is the nature of God, right? Um, because the philosophy of religion is not, strictly speaking, monopolized by just one particular group of belief, right? It's not completely monopolized by only theistic faiths. It's not completely uh, under the realm of only deism or pantheism. Or philosophy of religion is just philosophy of religion, right? We're trying to think about this entire subject as a whole, right? Now, that's not to say um, that I won't come at this from a specific angle. Everyone that teaches a course in whatever the particular topic is going to come at it from some angle. But that's not necessarily bad, right? Again, that's not necessarily a negative. We just want to make sure that we're trying to look at, teach the subject, right? Look at the subject in an objective or non biased way as we possibly can. That's not going to be completely, absolutely uh, impossible so far as it goes for us as human beings, right? And we're coming at it from some particular angle. But again, what we're concerned with is sound thinking, right? And working through the process, right? That's all we can be concerned with, right? For any of us. So those are the ways it's going to be similar to other courses in philosophy, right? That we're going to be asking the same sorts of questions. We're going to look at the same sorts of topics, and we're going to do that obviously with the same sorts of principles, logic to the best of our ability, or philosophical principles to the best of our ability. So just to show you, so you know where we're going with this, right? You may have already cheated and looked ahead here on the slides, but first and foremost, we're going to look at the relationship between faith and reason. Is there a relationship between faith, right, belief in God, and just reason? Then we're probably going to look at for the most part, we're going to try to keep this template. We may not stick exactly to this template here, but for the most part, we're going to try to go this route. After that, we're going to look at the relationship of language and God, right? How do we utilize or how do we employ language about God, right? Can we truly talk about God? If we can, how do we do it? So sometimes this is called God talk, right? So how do we utilize or employ language regarding God? Language, the relationship between language and God. Sometimes it's just called God talk, right? What is God talk? What is proper God talk? How do we do it, right? Can we do it, right? There are some philosophers that would even argue that you just can't talk about God. And we'll look at some of that when we get there. What I really want this course to be to as well is there are so many ways in which you can teach a philosophy of religion course. You can obviously talk about the things that we've talked about thus far, but then you can also introduce arguments for different positions, right? We'll say in this context, we'll say even you can introduce arguments for theistic positions. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that this course, that's what we're going to try to do. A lot of this course is going to be introducing or looking at classical arguments for, say, religious faith, right? Belief in God. Now, you may have taken some sort of apologetics course already. So you're going to be familiar with various arguments for the existence of God. But what I want to do in this particular course is I want to, if possible, try to introduce you to some new, old, classical arguments that have been discussed for possibly millennia within the philosophy of religion, within philosophy, right? I'll leave it up to any sort of apologetics course to give you sort of newer, right, more modern or popular types of arguments. Now there may be some overlap here, but I'll leave it up to the apologetics courses that you may eventually take or may not, but may eventually take that will discuss more of these again popular type courses as opposed to these old school, lots of intellectual history behind them, classical arguments for, say, theism, given by both Christian theists and non-Christian theists. At least one non-Christian theist, but trying to get to the existence of God, right? Now, as a byproduct of that, so I've got if you'll see on your slides here, I've got the topics underlined, right? So faith and reason, language, regarding God or God talk, classical philosophical arguments. But during that same little section there, you'll see another underline, and that's going to be, and the reason I put that together is because I'm thinking this is going to be made something like possibly like a subset of these classical arguments, and that is this: what is the nature, or what is God? Right? Now, you may be wondering, well, wait a minute, why would you put what is or what is the nature of God along with these arguments? Well, reason being that these classical arguments, not only do they, if they work, right, not only would they say prove the existence of God or demonstrate, right, the existence of God, but if these arguments run, they demonstrate a particular kind of God. And that's not to say that there are various gods or whatever. That's just to say that based on these kind of arguments, the result is a certain God, right? It's not just any old God will do kind of thing. It's not as if these arguments work, they're just as good at proving or demonstrating the existence of Zeus versus Thor versus Odin versus Isis versus Allah versus Yahweh, the Christian God, that there's this really certain type, right? Well, if there's a certain type, well, the way that we distinguish that is based upon the properties of the attributes or the nature of the what kind of God are we speaking of, right? Well, if these arguments work, they give you that kind, right? They give you a certain kind. They just won't work for any old. Again, they just won't work for any old God will do, right? They don't. It didn't work. They won't work for that purpose. Now, that can be a good thing or a bad thing because it can be a let's go bad news first, right? So it could be a bad news kind of thing first because if it doesn't work, well, then maybe you don't really get if the argument doesn't run, well, then not only do you get the specific God, but you really haven't gotten to the existence of any sort of God at all. Now, the good news may be that if they work, then they eliminate 99.9% of what people might construe in their mind about God. Well, okay, your argument for God works, but it still doesn't tell us the difference between Zeus or Christian's God or, Odin or whoever else. Well, no, if these arguments work, they are rid of all of those other types of gods. So that may be an interesting thing for you to keep in mind as we look at these different arguments, these classical types of arguments. Now, what we'll also look at, I don't know how many actual arguments we'll get into here in regards to philosophy of religion for atheism, but we'll at the very least look at what I think to be one of the more interesting arguments for atheism, right? As we discuss the philosophy of religion. In fact, it's again, as I even jot down here, it's my preferred, right, atheistic argument. And by that, I mean, I just believe it's a very interesting argument that theists really have to take seriously. Not that they don't have to take any argument seriously, right? But there's just something special about this kind of argument that I really think is a benefit to theists if they think through this kind of argument, this argument that we'll get to at some point. Now, I want to start off with a couple quotes. They may seem lengthy, but I can assure you that they are completely purposeful, right? And again, what we're talking about right now, we're moving into this whole aspect of faith and reason. What is the relationship between faith and reason? I want to read to you a couple quotes, and I think that you're going to go ahead and see where this thing's starting to go. I think you're going to see where this relationship is going to go, even though it's going to be a little more detailed. Listen to this quote here. This is going to be from Peter S. Williams' books. He writes a book on philosophy of religion called A Faithful Guide to Philosophy. Now listen to this. Philosopher David Horner holds up a book first published in 1724 and entitled Logic, or Right Use of Reason in the Inquiry After Truth, with a variety of rules to guard against error in the affairs of religion and human life, as well as in the sciences. Now, obviously, that's a very long title, right? Now, and by the way, that was not uncommon back in that day. Now, this book was the most influential logic text of its time. So this book that I just read off, that particular logic text was the most influential of its time. It was the standard used at Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, and Yale universities, and its influence continued for many decades, printed in some 20 editions. Horner then invites his audience to describe the book's author. Typical answers. This is according to Horner what he usually the response that he usually gets right when he asks this question. What do you think about this author of this textbook? The typical answers include that he was very smart. The author must have been very smart, right? He was analytical. He was boring, right? He was a philosopher. He was a logician, something like that. But no one, according to Horner, no one has suggested that the author was likely a pastor, a theological or a devotional writer, or a writer of hymns. Here's the bombshell. Yet the author was all of those. His name is Isaac Watts, composer of such beloved works as Joy to the World, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, and 700 other or more hymns. And he just also happened to be the most influential logician of his time. Horner adds, Those were the days when Christians did not simply assume that one must choose between either a sharp mind or a passionate heart. Now, let that sink in for a moment. We seem to live in a time and culture, right, that is staunchly anti intellectual, especially in regard to faith, right? Especially in regard to the faith communities, right? That it's almost unheard of for a Christian to be a composer, right, of not only hymns, but of logic textbooks, right, that are employed at Yale, Cambridge, all of these prestigious institutes of higher learning, right? Now, what you may already, if you're a step ahead of me here, what you may already begin to realize is that this current cultural acceptance of this anti-intellectualism and blind faith sort of thing, you may already start to see that this is not necessarily the intellectual history of theism, right? Specifically, at least Christian theism, that this anti-intellectual movement, this disdain for academia, this disdain for the development of the mind in relation to faith, you may start to see that maybe this wasn't always the case, right? So where did this come from? Where did this anti-intellectual attitude come from? Right? Where did this stem from? Right? Now, there's another quote for you, as if that wasn't enough. Think about this. I want to read this to you, and I'll you can, if you wanted to, technically you could cheat and look at the bottom here of who actually wrote this. But if you haven't yet, I want you to hear this and think of it. See if you can guess who stated this, right? Who made this claim. It's going to be a little heady. It's going to be a little wordy because, again, as the above, it just comes from a different era. In fact, it comes from the same era as that which we wrote above. Think about this. Here we go. Quote, some knowledge of the sciences also is, to say the least, expedient. No, may we not say that the knowledge of one, whether art or science, although now quite unfashionable, is even necessary. Next, in order to the knowledge of the scripture itself. I mean logic. For what is this, if rightly understood, but the art of good sense, of apprehending things clearly, judging truly, and reasoning conclusively? What is it viewed in another light but the art of learning and teaching? Whether by convincing or persuading, what is there, then, in the whole compass of science to be desired in comparison of it? Is not some acquaintance with what has been termed the second part of logic, metaphysics? If not so necessary as this, yet highly expedient, in order to clear our apprehension, without which it is impossible either to judge correctly or to reason closely or conclusively, by ranging our ideas under general heads, and in order to understand many useful writers, who can very hardly be understood without it. Should not a minister be acquainted too with at least the general grounds of natural philosophy? Is not this a great help to the accurate understanding of several passages of Scripture? Assisted by this, he may himself comprehend, and on proper occasions explain to others, how the invisible things of God are seen from the creation of the world. How, say, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork, till they cry out, O Lord, how manifold are thy works, in wisdom hast thou made them all. This particular person, this particular, dare we say, pastor, is arguing that you need to, in fact, that ministers need to, that pastors need to have some sort of understanding, some sort of training in logic and philosophy, in the natural sciences, in order to help us not only teach the scriptures more clearly, but to understand difficult aspects or parts of scriptures, right? Now, if you haven't already seen this, the founder of the Methodist Church is who stated this, John Wesley himself. Now, I didn't put this here, but John Wesley not only gives this argument why logic, philosophy, the natural sciences are important, but John Wesley also wrote a textbook on logic as well. So not only did we have the that Isaac Watts, the famous hymn writer, composed one of the most used logic textbooks of his time. But you also have the founder of one of the largest denominations, right? And at this time is at least still Orthodox, John Wesley, who began the Methodist Church. Some of this may be old news to you, right? You may be like, oh, yeah, okay, I already knew this. But some of you may be thinking, oh, wow, I really didn't. I thought that this apologetics type stuff or this philosophy type stuff was just supposed to be the domain of just a certain set of Christians and or people. But to use a very unprofessional term, back in the day, apparently Christians thought this should just be the domain of anyone that takes teaching seriously, right? Anyone that takes their Christian faith seriously is the relationship between faith and reason. Even the study, the official study of, say, disciplines like philosophy and logic. Now, with that said, you may find this next slide to be a bit puzzling. Well, not this slide, but let's go ahead and read this. Now, this is something from a document from the Catholic Church called Fides et Ratio, which means faith and reason. And this quote says, faith and reason, in fact, John Paul II actually made this statement. And the quote is this: faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. Right? So think about that. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth. In a word, to know himself. So that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves. So again, here we just see another example. We've seen Protestant examples, Orthodox Protestant examples, but then also too, even just the Roman Catholic classical understanding of faith and reason as well, is that faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of the truth, right? So we're already beginning to see that there's no reason to think, at least historically, that there's no divide between being a thinking person, right, an educated or a non-ignorant person, right, so far as we're capable, and faith, right, or belief in God. Now, here's another something I want to bring to your attention. Sometimes I'll even ask my classes this on campus: what do Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, Oxford, Cambridge, to go to the other side of the pond there, and others, what do these have in common? What do these particular institutions, right, aside from being just obviously a university and or a college, what do they have in common? Well, the answer that I'm actually looking for is they all began, right? They all had their origin. They all came about to train the clergy, ministers, not only the scriptures, right? Not only how to perform during the course of a sermon, right? But they also were there to train ministers, to train the clergy in logic, in philosophy, in the sciences, in metaphysics, right? All of these sorts of disciplines, again, that has, for whatever reason, have come to be looked at with some sort of disdain or disregard, right? As if they're not important for those that would be considered theists, right? Or part of the faithful, right? Again, let that sink in for a minute, how far we've drifted, how far our culture has drifted from this understanding of what it would mean for one to be a minister or a clergyman, or what it means to hold on to faith, right? And its relationship to reason. Think about the quotes that we've just gone over. Think about the statements that we've just made from various representations of Christianity. And think about these institutions, right? And again, these are just a few examples. We could go through more, right, about what was the purpose of such prestigious institutions, right? What was the purpose of the formation of colleges and universities all throughout Europe? and then initially here within the Americas, right? It was to instill this healthy relationship between the reason, right, and faith, all right. And there was never this view, this mainstream view, I should say, that faith and reason are just completely supposed to be separate, and or you have to, check your brain at the door, so to speak, when you walk into the church building. That you had to choose between either a sharp intellect or a passionate heart. Now, let me go ahead and make a remark here before we move to this next slide. We have to be very careful because we do want to point out, and we're about to do this in more depth here, what is the relationship between faith and reason. I think that we have to take seriously someone like Paul's advice, right? St. Paul, where he says, and it's not just advice, it's obviously true, but he says that knowledge builds up, or puffs up, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. That is, if we're not careful, that can very well be the case. You can hold on to this aspect of this intelligent side, or this intelligent, this desire to be intelligent. I could even say it that way. That you forget, right? That we let go of. That we forget to take as seriously the priority of love, right? Of love for God and love for one another. Now, of course, the other danger is that you disregard this aspect, right? You throw out the intellectual aspect, the sharp mind, the training of the mind in the service of the faith. You right now, it seems to be that's the dilemma that we find ourselves in our culture, that we've thrown out all of this. We don't want to go to either extreme. You don't want to fall out completely with faith and reason, the study of philosophy, the study of logic, all these sorts of things, and go all the way to the other extreme of it just being completely emotional, right? Yet at the same time, we don't want to throw out the emotional aspect of what it means to walk in faith, what it means to love, right, God and love one another. We want to incorporate these two things in a healthy way. So let's start to look at what we mean by this. Now that it seems like that we do have some sort of backing, that there's supposed to be some sort of relationship between faith and reason, we could still ask the question, well, what is it, right? Is the relationship between faith and reason revelation only? Is the relationship between faith and reason only? Is the relationship between faith and reason such that you prioritize reason over revelation, right? Or is it such that you prioritize revelation over reason? Or is it are the corollaries in the sense that you have revelation and reason? This is where we start to get into some depth, right? Maybe even some trouble, some difficult aspects, right? Now, you may see in the fine print that we're roughly going to follow the outline of the Feinberg and Geisler text, right? And I may even read a couple quotes out here as we discuss this. Now, it seems like that, at least historically, that we've already looked at the relationship between faith and reason, at least as historically understood, has been adopted, right, by the mainstream. And when I say mainstream, I should really say the larger Orthodox community, right? That there's a healthy relationship here between the two. However, that's not to say that there haven't been those that have wanted to argue that it should only be a revelation only type relationship, that the relationship between faith and reason shouldn't really be so much faith and reason, but only revelation. Well, what do we mean by that? We mean that faith and reason have zero to do with one another. This is, again, what we kind of see with this whole aspect of this anti-intellectual type aspect, right? That you only have revelation, that truth is only contained within, say, the Bible, or whatever the particular holy book that someone may be considering, and there is no room for rationality, reason, or faith at all in that. Now, you're already going to see part of the difficulty. Aside from just what we've looked at historically, it's hard to see how you're going to give some sort of argument that revelation only should be the case while simultaneously giving your argument, right? You're already pulling in reason. You're already pulling in argument. You're already pulling in rationality, so to speak, in giving reasons as to why you shouldn't follow reasons, right? Or why reason has no place in relation to faith. Well, if reason has no place in relation to faith, well, then why are you giving reasons to support your view that reasons don't have any sort of purpose within the faith aspect, right? Again, think about it. Any way to try to justify the revelation only position is going to have to assume reason, right, within itself, while it's giving an argument as to why reason shouldn't apply. That seems to possibly be even self-defeating, if not radically inconsistent. Now, again, that's not to say there weren't proponents of that, right? So you had people like sometimes Kierkegaard has argued, excuse me, is someone like this, where it's just revelation, right? That there shouldn't be any sort of relationship between the two. That's debatable. There are scholars on both sides of the issues, and even Kierkegaard himself would seem to want to say that his Christian faith is not 100% irrational. It's just that rationality doesn't have anything to do with it. But again, you already see some of the difficulty there. Sometimes Barth has been labeled as this. Karl Barth, right? The theologian Karl Barth, is that reason has no room. There's no room for faith, for things like reason, that it has to be revelation only. Now, those would be some sorts of, proponents. It's sometimes argued. Now, it's not this particular point of the course or this course. It's not the point of this course to argue about their particular positions, other than just to say that there are some that have tried to propose that view of revelation only, and it's arguable that they would have stood neatly within that camp, right? That's not maybe an oversimplification, but suffice to say, there are many that would try to argue them in that camp, right? And maybe they are. That may be something you may be interested in looking into in more depth. What I just want you to really be more concerned with is that these categories themselves, that there are proponents of revelation only. In fact, again, I would think that's probably where we see a lot of our society at the moment, right? That would want to argue that that's the relationship between faith and reason, is that there is no reason. It's faith, right? A fideism, so to speak. Now, there are some that would say reason only, right? Now, if you are an actual theist, right? If you are, say, a believer, and then if you are specifically a Christian believer, this is going to immediately seem to be a problem, right? In fact, this is how many would say that we were handed down what we would call liberal theology, right? Just radically liberal or leftist type theology that would demythologize, right, the Bible, meaning you would have certain liberal theologians, Rudolf Bultmann, other guys. Immanuel Kant may even have been one. We know that Thomas Jefferson, some of the deists were this way, where they demythologize. I get tongue tied on this every time. They demythologize the Bible in the sense that anything that is apparently supernatural or miraculous can't possibly be true because that's contrary to reason. Now, one, that's arguable, right? Not even arguable, but I would even say demonstrably false, that believing in the supernatural or the miraculous is contrary to reason, right? Nevertheless, it's this high aspect that no, it should be reason only, not revelation, that you're not really given any truth in revelation, that it's really the truth that we arrive at is just through reason. Well, that even seems to be difficult in and of itself, if for no other reason, no pun intended. Why bother with matters of faith at all anyway, right? I mean, if it's just reason, well, then why bother with faith at all? I mean, because if you're saying that really primarily the way we get to truth in regards to faith is through reason, well, then why are you giving any service to faith at all? Why give faith any sort of backdrop, any sort of ground at all to be in the conversation? But again, you've got proponents of that. So historically, within the history of philosophy, someone that would have famously or infamously argued that it's primarily reason would be someone like Benedict Spinoza. Uh, and this was most likely, if not completely, why his faith was completely composed of this odd sort of pantheism, right? Only that way he believed that he could get to by reason. He didn't accept the Bible or not, uh, or he didn't accept the Bible simply because it said it contained truths about God. It had to be strictly determined by the reason. There was no revelation that could be involved in that aspect. If we're going to talk about reason only and revelation only, when we talked about revelation only, you literally could not argue for revelation without, in regards to faith, without implying or assuming reason's role in it, right? I mean, again, just to argue is to assume reason has a place in the game, right? But then reverse that. When we talk about reason only, about faith, it seems really odd to try to even give faith any sort of, again, voice at all. If revelation only doesn't want to give voice to reason but has to, well, it seems to also be the case that, at least in some sense, reason has to give some sort of faith or give some sort of voice to faith just to get its conversation going, right? Well, what about the next category? What about reason over revelation? And that is to say, what about, is it possible that, okay, we have faith and we have reason, but we should prioritize reason over revelation? Now, have there been any sort of proponents of that? Well, yeah, there have been. Now, I said earlier that this is the reason only may have that gave us liberal theologians, right? That's probably not accurate. It's probably really more accurate to say that this reason over revelation is what gives us the very liberal types of theologians, because again, reason only, it's hard to explain why you would even bother with any sort of theologian, right? It's hard to explain why we'd bother with any sort of aspect of faith. But if we want to have faith, but we still want to say, well, the reason is really over all this kind of stuff, that's really what gives us, I'm correcting myself from earlier, that's really what gives us the radical, liberal, leftist sorts of theologies, like the demythologizing the Bible, right? Taking out all the miraculous things, not taking any of those revelatory teachings very seriously, like, say, the Trinity or the incarnation of Jesus, or the resurrection, a literal resurrection, or a literal virgin birth, those types of things. That's really when we're trying to place reason over revelation. Now, again, I would want to argue, just like I said a moment ago, that simply because you have a literal virgin birth or you have a literal resurrection, things of that nature, that's not contra reason, right? Reason doesn't tell you whether or not any of those types of things happen. Those are just arguments that can be either proven with reason or you can try to disprove them with reason. But reason itself doesn't tell you whether or not God can be incarnate, right? You would just try to employ reason to argue for one side or the other. But reason itself, it doesn't mean that you're more reasonable, right? Simply because you don't believe supernatural events happen. That's what we're getting at here. That's what we're getting at here when we're saying that, well, to prioritize reason over revelation seems to be a bit of special pleading in some sense, because basically it sounds as if you're trying to say that to be reasonable just means to say that you don't believe in those sorts of things. Well, again, that doesn't get you there, right? In fact, it gets you sort of a liberal ideology or a liberal theology that really is a weakened form of some sort of orthodox belief. Well, the other error would then be to swing completely to the other side, right? We talked about a minute ago that just as you can go into error by one extreme, you can also go into error regarding the other extreme. Right now, you can say, well, it's revelation completely over reason. I want you to think about, again, what might the difficulties with that be? If reason over revelation poses difficulties, well, then what might the difficulties be, if there are any, of revelation over reason, right? Well, I'm going to at least toss out the first that I would give, and I want you to think about this more as well, is that this is where we would say something like, I would argue something like presuppositionalism comes into play. When you're trying to say that revelation is just 100% standalone in the sense that it's over and above reason. Well, one of the difficulties with that is, and this is what I think the difficulty with presuppositionalism is it seems to come across as circular, right? As begging the question for your own particular revelation, right? Because it seems like if you're going to say that revelation is completely over reason, well, then you're forfeiting the ability to see what is and isn't a revelation, right? What is a true revelation versus a false revelation? Because if it's revelation over your ability to reason, well, then how do you adjudicate between a false revelation and a true revelation, right? This is why so many would argue that presuppositionalism can fit with either Islam or Christianity or Judaism or any of these other sorts of beliefs. If you're just going to simply say that it's 100% revelation over reason, well, then each adherent of each of those theistic systems or each of those belief systems can say that their revelation is taking priority over any sort of reason, and there's nothing to adjudicate between the different camps, right? Let's say that you've got I don't even know if they exist, but let's say that you've got an Islamic presuppositionalist and you've got a Christian presuppositionalist, and they're arguing back and forth. Well, my revelation, I'm using my reason solely in line under this revelation given me by God, which is true, by the way. Well, the other guy's going to say exactly the same thing, right? The practitioner of the other faith system is going to say exactly the same thing. So there's actually a couple other problems, but if you need to push pause and try to think through that, I want to see if you can come up with a couple of your own if possible. Now, let's go ahead and look at this last here. And obviously, just so you know where I stand, and I think that I think this fits within the mainstream of the Orthodox community, is that there's a relationship between faith and reason that is of this: revelation and reason, not revelation over reason, not revelation under reason or reason over revelation, not just revelation only, not just reason only, but just revelation and reason. Now, one of the reasons, no pun intended again, that we might want to say that is simply that if it's true that God exists, and if it's true that God made all, and if it's true that if God made all, then he made you, or the human intellect, the human mind, that there should be some sort of healthy relationship between the fact that God speaks and or communicates and the fact that we must employ our reason in our interpretation of these sorts of things, right? Now, that's not to say that we can't err in our reason, right? That's not to say that, as Geisler and Feinberg like to point out, that our reason is not our noetic structure, right? Meaning what we know, right? Our ability to know what we know. It's not to say that's not touched in a sense, right, by sin and our fallenness and all those sorts of things. But it is to say that we still can't even have these sorts of discussions, right? What is the relationship between faith and reason, without employing reason, which seems to say, or it seems to imply, they at least go together in some sense. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for thinking even this. One, just a simple example, would be the fact that Jesus consistently appealed to the miraculous, right? That people could see, that they could understand, um, in his efforts to persuade them to believe the claims about himself, right? Now, of course, he wouldn't have had to do any of those sorts of things, but he gave them evidences and or reasons to trust the claims that he was making. In other words, he didn't just walk around saying, "Hey, believe me. I know you don't have any reason to believe that I am making these radical claims about myself. Just have faith and believe." No, in fact, he even said, quote, if you don't believe in me, at least believe in the works that I do, right? At least believe in the miracles that I do, that testify to who Jesus is, right? He's trying to give some sort of rationale, some sort of reason, some sort of evidence, some sort of uh, trustworthiness to who he says he is. He's trying to give you a reason to his trustworthiness, right? Now, even if you didn't believe that, right? Even if you don't believe that, which is obviously probably not the case here, but even if you don't believe that, you still would have to admit that he's still doing that. He's still appealing to that. He's not just running around saying blind faith, leap into the dark, all this kind of stuff. He's trying to give people reason to follow him, right? Now, we could say easily that usually Augustine and even Aquinas, St. Aquinas, are usually safely within this category, that they believe that there's this relationship between reason and revelation. It's not necessarily just one or the other, but they go together. Again, go back up to the quote from JP2, the quote about them being one, they're like two wings, right, on one bird. Each, when it's functioning correctly, helps us to reach truths about God, right? Now, some might argue that Augustine would put revelation over reason, but it's also just as persuasively. Again, I'm not concerned that you guys get into details of which theologian, which church father, whoever stands in which camp. Just knowing that you have an idea of those names, some of those names there. Um, it's important to remember that both Augustine and Aquinas, when we talk about the relationship between revelation and reason, this last category here, they didn't think that reason could get you to saving or salvific faith, right, in God. But they did think that if you employed the right tools of reason, that if you employed sound philosophical principles and sound philosophy, they would argue that you could know, right, believer or non-believer, that there actually was a God, right, that there was one true, simple. I mean, when I say that, I'm talking about divine simplicity. That this type of God actually did exist. Again, they didn't believe that you could reason into a salvific relationship with God. They would think that they would argue you need revelation for that, right? Or grace for that in some sense. For instance, like you wouldn't know the Trinity unless it was for revelation. You wouldn't know the truth of the incarnation unless it was for revelation. And then, just as importantly, that you couldn't be in right standing with God apart from revelation. But they did think that revelation and reason work together in the sense that you could know, just using reason, that there was, in fact, a God. Um, and then they may even go further, there are many classical philosophers now that would go further and say, you can know that the Bible is a completely reliable historical text through reason apart from revelation. Um, all of those sorts of things, right? Now, they would also argue, though, that because you have to have revelation and reason, that revelation is not going to contradict reason. Important point here, that revelation is not going to contradict reason, even though it may go beyond reason. Well, what does that mean? So again, let's go back to the example of the Trinity. The Trinity teaches, right, primarily that God is triune in nature, meaning that there's one God, there's one nature, or there's one essence, but there are three persons in that nature or that share that essence, right? Share that nature, that essence. one God, one nature, three persons. Now, that may go radically beyond logic, but it's not illogical, meaning there's no contradiction. If you're a logician, there's no contradiction in saying that there's one what and three who's. One what and three who's. There's no contradiction there. Now, the contradiction would be to say there's one God and not one God, or there's three gods and one God, or there's three natures and not three natures, right? Or one nature and three natures, right? Those would be logical types of contradictions. But to say there's one nature and three persons, again, goes beyond our logic, right? It goes beyond our ability to try to grasp that or to understand that, to comprehend that, which, by the way, should be a positive, because if God is completely grasped by the finite mind, well, then he's just by definition not God. He's just by definition not infinite, right? Infinite. But if you can comprehend, right, that means completely wrap around. That means that you've literally comprehended, you've put your head around the infinite. So there should be something, right? If something like Christianity is true, then there should be something that is not illogical, but logical. That's something that surpasses logic, that goes beyond logic, but does not contradict it, right? Now, Aquinas and, again, Augustine would probably fit into this type of camp. Definitely Aquinas would fit into this type of camp, and probably even Augustine. Now, one of the last little points here is that we want to draw the distinction here, because I think, again, with our presuppositionalist friends, this is a place where sometimes we would argue that they make a mistake in saying that they want to say, but wait a minute, if God is real, then God is the grounding for all of these sorts of things, right? Then God is the ultimate truth which grounds all of these, whatever we've talked about thus far, logic and revelation and reason and all these things. Well, the thing is that the classical philosopher would agree with that God is the ontological or the metaphysical grounding for all of these sorts of things, right? He is what makes them true, right? He grounds them. However, that's an ontological position. That's a metaphysical position, or an ontological position that has to do with being, right? But epistemologically, how do we know that? We know that from the bottom up, right? So ontologically, God is first in order of being. He's first in order of being, and then that's first, right? But in the way of knowing, epistemology's first. That's not to put God on the dock. It's not to say that God is under our reason. It's not to say that our reason is over and above God. It's just to say that the way we know that God is ontologically prior, the way we know that is we have to come to know that, right, in some manner. We look at the effects and we reason back from the effects to the cause, right? We reason from the effects of God back to God. So that's not to say that the effects are superior to God, right? Clearly, they're not. They're his effects. But we get to God by the effects, by studying the effects, learning the effects, and reasoning back to, again, per Romans chapter 1, from effect to cause, right? So God is first in order of being, right, ontologically speaking. But epistemologically, epistemology is first in the order of knowing, because that's the only way we could ever get to know that, right? Even if you were to say, well, no, revelation, all right, but you had to be told revelation first, right? Then you reason from that truth back to that God is the number one, right? So you can't get around it. Now, I want to leave you with a little thought here. Actually, two little thoughts, right? Tricking myself. Now, let me read this to you, and I'll fly through this one because I really want you to think about the next one. The full context of Christian scripture portrays God as the author of order, and that God is the author of all of reality, or we could say the real, right? So if God is the author of order, right, scripture maintains that God is a God of order, right? And if God is the author of everything that's actually real, right, that which is real, if God is the author of that, then it should therefore result in no surprise that if considered properly, so long as the claims of philosophy correspond to reality, so long as the claims of theology correspond to reality, and so long as the claims of science correspond to reality, well, if God created reality, well, then God is just the author of all of those things. So maybe you've heard that little fancy goofiness said in this way. Maybe you've heard it said like this: all truth is God's truth, right? If God is the author of Scripture, well, God is also the author, the creator of nature. Meaning that if there's something true, whether it be in Scripture or in nature, then God is the author of that, right? And if God being the author, then he cannot err, then it's true, right? So we don't, again, so here's just, that's kind of a parting thought as to why we don't want to say there's this radical distinction between reality and how we discover reality through reason and then revelation, right? Because God is the author of both of these. If there's a problem, then the problem either lies, as Augustine would say this, the problem either lies with our interpretation of nature. If it contradicts Scripture, then the problem is either our interpretation of nature or our interpretation of the Scripture. Because if God is the author of both, then there can't be a contradiction. So if there were an apparent contradiction, the problem would have to be on our end of the spectrum, if God exists, right? And if God really did those things. Now, this may be something just to kind of sit back and listen to. I want you to take this in. Basically, the question, before I read this, you could pose a question, and this could be the answer to the question. So the question could be something like this: should we utilize philosophy in the study of theology? And so this is how that question would be answered. Should we utilize philosophy or reason in the study of theology? Theological inquiry will naturally begin to ask difficult questions. Again, guys, really pay attention to this. I want you to get this. Theological inquiry will naturally begin to ask difficult questions. As a result, all men will begin to interpret these questions and their particular answers within the framework and the construct of their particular worldview. That is, from their own philosophical outlook. So listen, therefore, the question is not if a man will be a philosopher in regard to his theological view. The question is rather, will he be a good philosopher in regard to his theological view? In other words, man will employ some sort of philosophical understanding regarding theology. You're going to do it. So everybody's doing this. And unfortunately, if his philosophy is wrong or held subconsciously or uncritically, this will be devastating to true theology regarding, say, the one true God, right? Ideally, then, theology should simply be logically reasoned discourse concerning the truths of God. This view, then, that philosophy is the handmaid to proper theology is healthy and beneficial as the Christian church inquires into the subject and persons of God. Though we may also and do receive divine truths via special revelation, we must be able to receive even these truths in a coherent and logical fashion. Again, what would it mean to say that you receive divine truths that are completely incoherent? Or that you receive divine truths, so you read something from Scripture that's completely contradictory, right? Illogical, incoherent, right? What would that even mean? So, in the sense that even these are not contradictory, these divine truths, or absurd. This, of course, is not to say that some of these truths may go beyond logic, as in the Trinity again, but they will never go against logic. That is, truths of God are neither illogical nor unreasonable. Here we must side with one such as Aquinas, right? This is the angle from which I'm going to come. I think this is the most reasonable position to hold here. So, having said that, side with one such as Aquinas. Now, of course, he simply espouses a view that purports no conflict between the two, philosophy and theology, so long as both correspond to reality. Then the relationship is absent of conflict and are, as a result, complementary. Now, if God is a God of order and against confusion, as he is, 1 Corinthians 14:33, then it should seem to follow that all aspects of God are in no way irrational or contradictory to reason, resulting in the need and the necessity of a proper understanding and use of philosophy in the study of theology. Now, if you want to read that again, you've got your PowerPoints there. You can go back and read that because, again, I think that just really is a nice summary of the relationship between theological inquiry and philosophy, or in other words, faith and reason. Right. So, having said that, I hope you got something out of this particular lecture. If you need to, listen to it again while you're jogging or running or working out or whatever it is you do. And until next time, be safe.